Well, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry we're starting a couple of minutes late. Unsurprisingly, we've had one or two internet connection problems, or at least I have, but it's great that we're on screen. Welcome to this session. Just a little word about me. I'm actually one of the founder members of SWIDN. It's an idea a number of us had in 2005, 2006, and I'm delighted at the way that it's gone from strength to strength. And is now putting on such a wonderful few days of events. And I also chair something called the Joffrey Charitable Trust. We took a decision to provide some funding to SWIDN as well, and it's definitely a very good decision. So we're extremely pleased about the way everything has gone. And it's my pleasure this morning to chair this session on advocacy and justice, who, how, and why. I'm delighted to have three panelists: Simon Starling, who's the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Research at Bond, Pamela Ebanyat from Sendakau, the Uganda Country Director, and Shaheen Ashraf, who's the Head of Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide. I'm not going to say any more about them. We want to leave time for questions at the end, but you have their bios. And we're going to go in the order of Simon first, and then Shaheen, and then we're going to Pamela, and we're kind of going to start big, as it were, and then get down a bit more to the local level. You will see on the screen there are the sort of protocols about being part of these events. I'm not going to read through that whole thing, but include your name, be polite, keep your video on, and put your questions in the chat if you would like these to put to the panel. And I hope that I'm going to get some help in putting those together and putting those together. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Simon to get us cracking and having a look at the question we have posed: advocacy and justice, who, how, and why. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Myles, and nice to meet you all. As Myles said, I work at Bond, which is the network for international development charities in the UK, and I was going to talk a little bit about the sort of big picture around advocacy and how advocacy and justice issues sort of connect from the sort of international down to the sort of more national and local level, and talk a little bit about some of the international processes that we've been engaged in recently, and then talk a little bit more about the UK, because there's lots happening in the UK on the development front at the moment, and then perhaps talk a little bit about the sort of the role of organisations like your own in advocacy work. And then my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more specifically and more in depth about some of the issues. So I'm going to try and set the scene, if you like. Obviously, you know, advocacy work is sort of central to all development work, and I suspect that actually all of you are involved in advocacy in different ways at different levels. So to get a program off the ground in any developing country, you're going to be talking to a range of stakeholders, communities, local government, you know, national government, donors. And so the sort of idea that that there's this set of professional people doing advocacy at a sort of international or national level is slightly misleading, because I think actually in some ways we're all involved in different ways of trying to sort of work towards influence to create change. So in my mind, advocacy is about trying to achieve change. I think we're all trying to do that. Why is that important? If you're coming at it from a sort of, you know, an organization that runs programs in a particular developing country or countries, you know, and I've had this conversation with colleagues when I've worked overseas, and there's something about the importance of recognizing that whatever, however successful our particular interventions are, we're always working in a complex environment. Development is a complex issue, and you always need to be thinking about how to make the changes that you're achieving bigger scale and more sustainable. And that sort of shifts you to start thinking about how do we make that happen? How do we influence change? How do we influence structures? How do we influence policies to enable those changes to be much more sustainable in the long term? So, you know, it's actually not enough just to be running a sort of a successful project unless you're also thinking about, well, how do we take these lessons to scale? How do we sort of embed this in a wider approach? How do we get this taken up by government, and all those kinds of questions, which is, I'm sure, the kind of things that you are all thinking about on a regular basis, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk more to in a minute. I guess what's more challenging particularly for sort of smaller organizations without huge government relations departments to think about is the international scene. You know, what is the relevance of some of these big international processes to the work that we do as small organizations on the ground in various developing countries? And that is often quite hard to see. And I think I could talk, maybe as an example, talk a bit about the recent G7 process that was hosted by the UK government. So the G7 itself is a you know, not democratic body of rich countries that get together to talk about a whole set of issues, which sometimes touch on issues that are relevant to developing countries and development issues. Why is it important to engage on those kind of things? I think it's although the sort of the tracking what happens in those meetings all the way down to impact on the ground for more marginalized people in developing countries is quite hard. There is something about the sort of the framing that happens at the sort of international level that does matter in terms of how things are set up. So obviously development and marginalization are not sort of isolated things, and how the system the sort of current international system is set up to disadvantage developing countries. So the net outflows from the developing world to the rich world still vastly outweigh what goes into developing countries from the rich world, and actually aid is a tiny proportion of that. So the system is still set up in a skewed way that disadvantages developing countries. So we also have to be thinking about that very big picture and doing what we can at the international level to try and change those structures that effectively keep poorer countries poor. So that's why it's important to kind of engage in those kind of more systemic conversations. Bond this year was the host of the Civil Society 7 Summit. So around the G7 Summit that the UK hosted this year, we brought together civil society from, actually not just from the UK, but from other G7 countries and from the Global South. And we tried to pull together what civil society thought were the things that the G7 should be doing. So what were the policy recommendations that we as civil society were making towards the G7 itself? And that's an official part of the G7 process. So it did enable us to have some really interesting conversations with people from all over the world, come together around a set of shared policy asks that we thought were important, ranging from nutrition to care to social protection to we had a whole range of asks because we were a very diverse bunch of people, and we had a sort of formal place to sort of pass those policy asks and make those recommendations into the G7, the formal kind of G7 summit. So we had lots of meetings with the UK Sherpa and other Sherpas, and so we had a sort of a mechanism for sort of feeding in those concerns of ours from civil society. You can argue about whether or not how much impact that has, and it would take a really serious piece of evaluation work to kind of work that out. We did a bit of sort of reflective work and self-evaluation around that with our colleagues and with some people in government, and we had set out about 60 policy asks going into that process from civil society. We reckon that about 20 of them were partially met and a handful of them were kind of fully met. And so it would be impossible to attribute that really to any particular, you can't say that it was as directly as a result of the civil society interventions, those things were agreed by the G7. But there's certainly some where the feedback that we had was, this wouldn't have happened without you. So some of it we managed to get some attention and sort of agreement in the sort of final leaders communique around civil society space, and the sort of language around this kind of a more One Health approach to health systems going forward. So there were definite things that you could track that were appeared to be the result of the sort of work we did on the civil society front. Why is that important? Again, it's about the framing, it's about the narrative, it's about those priorities then being kind of taken forward in various other institutions, carried into national donor frameworks, and then into, and these countries are also then very influential within the multilateral processes, so that then priorities then get into the multilaterals, which then do have a direct kind of engagement with sort of developing countries. So I wouldn't the sort of the tracing the sort of decisions at the G7 into various UN bodies and down to developing countries and down to finally to sort of local communities around it is really difficult. But I do think the sort of the framing of some of these issues and the narrative around it is really important. That was one of the things that we managed to do at the G7 was, the UK government in particular was keen to paint this as a hugely successful result, and huge progress made on vaccines and things like that. And we were able to kind of basically call them out on that and say, no, it really wasn't. There's still a huge problem with vaccine inequity. There's still a huge inequities in the global system. And we were able then to sort of stop them sort of pushing forward this narrative that everything was fine, and continue to talk about the sort of structural inequalities within the world. So
I'm going to come towards bringing you to a conclusion, because we want to make sure we've got plenty of time for the other presentations and some questions and answers. Can I give you another 30 seconds to finish off?
Okay, sure. Sorry, lost track of time there, Myles. So I guess what I would say, you'd have also seen within the UK over the last year or so that lots of we're sort of struggling to engage and have influence on the very top of the UK government. And that is partly as a result of us as a sector not doing a good enough job of communicating the stories of success. How have we, what changes have we made in terms of helping poor and marginalised people around the world, and engaging with the public around that, and engaging and sort of communicating that into government and towards the public. So there's lots that you all can be doing at your local levels in terms of relationships with the local media, relationships with local MPs, and then engaging with networks like SWIDN and with Bond to sort of engage in wider advocacy pushes around the sector. So so in summary, I'd say, I think all of us are engaged in advocacy at different levels. The international stuff is important, but not perhaps as important as the very local levels that you are working at. But don't forget about the national level contacts as well, because I think all of those needs to be changing all of those if we're going to achieve the sort of longer term changes that we're striving towards. That was a long 30 seconds, Myles, was that? I think Myles is frozen. I could have gone on for a bit longer.
I think we may have lost Myles. Shaheen, would you like to carry on from Simon? Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. I think that's you come at it at the angle where we as Islamic Belief Worldwide were involved with the bond around the C7. And for us, it was really important to have engaged in that dialogue that actually, in the end, influenced various elements of what the G7 were saying particularly around international aid, around addressing some of the commitments around, various SDGs and things like that. And for us, I think specifically we came in specifically around the race agenda and the decolonization agenda when it came to supporting Bond with the actual narratives that were then shared with the G7 in that sense. So yeah, I mean, really hands up to Bond for having civil society actors play a big role in this. because ultimately you can support in, as a collective, you can support in decision making. What I want to do now is I want to kind of hone in on one of the SDGs, which is SDG 16. And the question was posed, you know, how does this work on a global level, and how would it work on a national level? It's interesting to note that, you know, Agenda 2030, which is around the SDGs that Myles spoke about, that they spoke about, that was spoken about earlier, you know, this government, for example, made this unprecedented commitment to address things like conflict, violence, injustice, through a very interestingly comprehensive approach. And it kind of affirmed things around peaceful, just and inclusive societies, which is what we all want. And the goal of SDG 16, however, as we know, for all of us who are in the international aid sector, doesn't work in isolation. You have to have it marry up with SDG 5, which is around gender equality, or SDG 10, or SDG 17, which is around, you know, bringing people together in that sense. So all of those kind of narratives play a very, very critical role. You know, and the interesting thing is, by 2030, on an international scale, 80% of the world's poorest will live in fragile states. So reflecting on this, we have to see increasing global commitments to align with the development and security agendas in that space. So the UK, it was really important, and coming back to what was said earlier, you know, interestingly, the UK played a really crucial role in the adoption of SDG 16. And that was kind of ensuring the shortcomings of the MDGs, which were the Millennium Development Goals, from the lessons that were learned from there, is for insofar as to say that we have to promote positive peace, include respect for human rights, have participatory politics, have accountability, and have transparency in this space that contributes to the development and poverty eradication, and that's on a global level. So the UK has, the government itself has led on conflict, and, you know, now, which is now the FCDO, in its strategy from 2015 to 2020, you saw all these intersecting objectives, which were strengthening around peace and security. So what I'm coming down to is, okay, talking about, so how do the SDGs work on a national level? You know, on a national level, SDGs is about reducing crime, supporting the most disadvantaged and vulnerable children and young people through high quality local services so that no one is left behind. And also for those of us, you know, who regularly are involved in watching media or part of the media narrative, you know, part of it is actually delivering swift justice. So if you look at the Her Majesty's government's narrative on SDGs, you will see that the SDGs as national priorities are around delivering swift justice, ending rough sleeping and homelessness, making sure that poverty is addressed through enabling progression, for example. But interestingly, at the heart of this setting is what needs are, for me specifically as a Solihull councillor. When I come back to it, I am the head of global advocacy, but I can speak about my national level and my regional level and my local level delivery. You know, at the heart of the setting, for example, when the government sets out about reducing crime or supporting vulnerable children or delivering swift justice, what you realize is people's potential. That kind of sets out the narrative around what happens in the economy, how we strengthen society, and how we increase fairness. You know, as an opposition spokesperson, I certainly see the lack of funding, the inequality of education, and the burden the burden that is placed on young people. You know, things like the lack of accessible apprenticeships. So for me, for what was said earlier by Stephen, is, you know, there is this whole narrative around how the SDGs and how we need to play a crucial role in advocacy from a national level, and how we bring the SDGs to A4. You know, for example, the levelling up agenda on education standards, so that all children are prepared to go out into the world, to create and strengthen a society, and to create a better economy for themselves, you know. And as a councillor, what I've seen is that more needs to be done with local authorities to ensure that this particular goal, SDG 16, is realised. Because it's not just about an international level commitment as something being over there. It is about here, you know, and the priority of our nation as well. So for example, you've got 188 district borough city councils, and you've got 25 county councils. Actually, how do you then feed that whole global narrative into a national narrative? The problem here is, you know, I think that the problem is that we should be able to, from the SDG side, we have to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. And for us, that advocacy narrative that was spoken about earlier by Stephen is what is needed here in the UK on a national level. So it's about bringing public awareness on the narrative around SDGs, you know, but effectively within the UK, more so on a global scale, you have effective structures and processes for reporting. On a local level, you don't have such effective structures and processes for reporting. And in answer to, you know, the questions that Myles set out for us earlier, is, you know, Her Majesty's government in previous times has shown incredible leadership on a global level around SDG 16. But for me, I think what is the missed opportunity is for the global leadership to actually happen on a domestic level as well. And the leadership by signaling support for UK-based organizations such as, you know, SWIDN, to be able to recognize how we've done on the SDGs. And I've specifically honed in on 16 here. And then how do we then publicly communicate the need for these SDGs? I think that's another thing that needs to be done within the UK context. And then also trying to ensure that the UK understands its performance on the SDGs by openly disclosing our progress like it does on a global scale. Because if you're talking about the levelling up agenda on education standards in the UK should also happen as well as globally. But interestingly, going back to what was said earlier around the G7, you know, the first round of cuts that we've had critical to the aid agenda was on family planning, reproductive health care, women's rights organizations. Education was down 30%, water and sanitation was down by 39%, and humanitarian aid was down by 18%. So if you look at it, you know, from my perspective on the work that I do, I see a massive cut around gender equality in this space. And this is one of the things that we brought to the G7. So from an advocacy perspective, we brought this to the G7 that actually, as the government continues to reduce its aid budget, what we're seeing is billions and billions and billions of pounds being cut from, you know, from programming. For example, you will have on a global level 700,000 fewer girls being educated by girls' education programs. You'll have 2 million women who are fewer supported by humanitarian assistance. You'll have 8 million fewer women and girls supported by nutrition interventions. And then you'll have 9 million fewer women supported by access to clean water. And then you have to then think about how do I then realize that at a national level. So going back to Myles, if Myles is on the call, I'm not sure if he is, but going back, Myles.
I am, Shaheen,
okay.
Yes, and I'm watching time, so we need to move on,
good.
I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Myles, I think the answer to your question is that we need to show leadership and support signaling for UK organisations, and we need to publicly communicate on the SDGs as well. And then from a UK perspective, we need to understand the performance and disclose our progress in and around that. So back over to you, Myles, and thank you.
Fantastic, Shaheen. Thanks so much. And thanks for reminding us that the SDGs are global. They're not just for poorer countries. A really important point. Pamela, I'm going to move straight on to you, and then we'll see if we can got time for a question or two at the end. So Pamela, over to you.
Thank you. May I request my slides to come on? While it comes on, I work with Sendacow, and of course, Sendacow is one of the organizations that work at the local level with the vulnerable people. And what we do majorly is we ensure that our communities have improved farm systems while having mainstreaming gender and social inclusion, and to allow them to have improved enterprises as well. I want to pick up from Sahin and Simon on the high level advocacy that they've been talking about, and then bringing it down to the local level of how best we carry out the advocacy. Next slide, please. Of course, when we look at what happens at the local level, the process of equipping people to understand and use and shape the law is something not very easy. And of course, we have particular organizations at the local level that have convened legal empowerment networks for purposes of learning. And because of this, we have seen a real progress against injustice happening in these communities. And for instance, this Namati Legal Empowerment Network successfully advocated for incorporation of justice into the United Nations 2030 SDG goals. So they were able to advocate for that, and that's why we have SDG 16 that talks about justice. Next slide, please. When we look at, again, the global concerns, we are focusing on the recent UN General Assembly that happened. The Secretary General made mention of about 246 million people in Africa who go to bed hungry without food. And the continent's 59 million stunted children as well. We know that this is morally and socially unacceptable. And we believe that delivering food security, according to his speech, he said that delivering food security in Africa at a greater scale calls for prioritizing technologies, climate, and financing. And also at the G7 2021 summit, where a group of 7 of the world's largest economies agreed to end the unabated coal in the domestic power systems by 2030 by committing to a bold climate action. We know at the local levels, of course, if I can say local levels, mainly what is used is fuel wood and charcoal. That is what is used. But then at the G Summit, the bold action against climate change was agreed upon with the hope that our local communities would be able to embrace clean energy by 2030. Next slide, please. Looking at some of the justices and advocacy that happens at the local level, what we see is, for instance, protecting the community lands. The concern is that there's a global demand at the moment on land and natural resources, and this makes protection of community lands and natural resources an urgent priority. So organizations have supported communities to use natural land laws to protect their indigenous lands. And then also at the national and local organizations work with partnerships to implement community and land protection and research impacts have happened. Governments have been supported to enact and implement legislations that protect community land rights and advocate for increased global protection for community land and natural resource rights. Next slide. There's an example in Ethiopia where we have local communities working together to manage reforestation in a project that happened in Sodo and Humbo in Ethiopia. This work was done by World Vision, where they used a farmer-managed regeneration technique together with the communities. And the communities there were happy, and they said that they were ready to protect the forest, they were ready to face the challenges. They needed to establish a legacy for the project, for the community, and strive for more benefit for the entire community. Actually, besides the hillside, most of the community members did not have any bylaw, they didn't have a bylaw on how to manage the forests on the hillside. So there was massive deforestation. And of course, because of the demand of fuel wood, the demand of pieces of land for agriculture, there was no law that was protecting that forest at Humbo and Sodo. So what happened is that using a community-driven reforestation approach, this hillside was able to be reforested. And now they understand and they have their laws on how to manage and acquire fewer wood still from those protected forests. Next slide. I want to give an example of Uganda, and particularly where Sendakao works. You know, Uganda has over 1 million refugees, both in the North and West Nile areas. And of course, those areas that have been identified, they are vulnerable to deforestation because the refugees use the fuel wood for cooking. They also use it for construction. So as Sendakao, we have been advocating together with the local governments and promoting tree planting, agroforestry, and also using the farmer-managed natural regeneration techniques. We've used the farmer natural regeneration techniques just basically to ensure that the indigenous tree species are kind of protected by regenerating the stumps that are there. So the communities have been able to embrace this, and we've seen that there is a lot of tree planting, and communities have, they've also embraced bylaws where particular species that are very protected are not cut down, and these are marked. And then the communities have been able to protect more of those species that are very important to them. Next slide, please. Sendakao has also worked with people with disability. We know that justice and advocacy is also important for people with disability. That is the SDG 10, which talks about reduced inequality. Of course, in September 2015, the 17 SDGs that were developed were built on a principle of leaving no one behind. And the new agenda emphasized on holistic approach, whereby it was mentioned that we needed a world full of inclusive people with disability. Particularly as Sendakao, we have had interventions where we have youth skilling, and we've done this to especially to be inclusive, and we have promoted people with disability having access to decent work and therefore promoting economic growth. Thank you. Next slide. We've also looked at involving people with disability in agriculture. You know, most of the time we think people with disability that are physically disabled or in whichever way, they are not able to participate in agriculture. But putting together particular techniques, for instance, using raised gardens and a kind of adaptive gardens that can include rows where a wheelchair can pass, people with disability are able to participate in agriculture as well. And in Uganda, we've had deliberate effort where Sendakao has targeted 12.5% persons with disability as their project beneficiaries. Next slide, please. We've also ensured that people with disability participate in inclusive financing, where people with disability and women participate in village savings and loans associations. They are trained on financial literacy and also advocate for inclusive financing through linkages and financial institutions. So now you have people with disability also able to participate together, hand in hand with other people who have ability, and they are able to save as well. Next slide, please. The health justice is also happening in our communities where patients' rights are being abused. In most of the developed countries, you find that there are progressive healthcare policies, but there is massive breakdown of delivery. But we find that patients are treated abusively, essential drugs are missing, there is no privacy when they're having visits, but the health and lives of people are at risk. Organizations such as NAMITI have supported the Ministry of Health. They've created patients' rights offices at every health facility, and this is in Mozambique. They've also developed a comprehensive training package and operational manual to guide the functioning of these offices. So because of these advocacy kind of interventions, at least the patients' rights are now being respected. Next slide, please. And also in our in the Sendakao Kenya program, community-based health financing has been promoted. We know this contributes to the SDG 3 of good health and well-being. And of course, community-based health financing, it involves community members coming together, forming a health insurance scheme, and they collectively lobby for consistent availability of drugs and other health supplies at the government health centers. And as communities, they've also held consultative meetings with the health management teams to address issues of the health workers' attitudes in handling the patients. And this has contributed to increased access to health services. Next slide. So what are some of the learnings and to the impacts to our advocacy and justice at grassroots and higher levels? We have learnings from still the NAMATI legal empowerment networks that use the paralegals. And these paralegals, they work with communities to solve the justice problems at grassroots. In some of the organizations, we have some community support resource persons that also support to solve those justice problems. And these have improved lives of hundreds of people every year. There is also experience drawn from grassroots to advocate for changes that make systems better for everyone. And together with the communities, information is collected and used for advocacy to reform laws and policies. And these changes can positively affect the entire nation. Next slide. So we've also seen that there's been food security and safe nutrition as a result of advocacy. There's inclusive targeting of people with disability to a specific percentage, which is promoted. There's collaboration and access to government programs, which have strengthened. And then education of children with disability have been improved with enabling environment promoted. And then access to services from local governments have been improved. Self-esteem have been gained, and access to inclusive financing using the village savings and loans associations have been restored. So generally, we see that the advocacy and justice interventions by the various organizations, including Sendakao, have really been helpful to communities, but still there is still much more work to be done since injustice is going on. Last slide. So thank you so much. This is just a picture in one of our projects in Sendakao of seeing community groups, institutions that are supporting a person with disability to mend their houses and make it better. So these are some of the interventions that are done at local level to support one another. The group strengthening the social capital that is there to support vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals to enable them to access better livelihoods. Thank you so much, and over to you, Myles.
Thank you so much, Pamela, and thank you to all our panelists. I thought those were all brilliant presentations. As always, the consequences of having brilliant presentations is that you don't leave yourself enough time at the end for questions and answers. So I'm basically going to ask each of our panelists one question, and it's the same question to all of you. And I'm going to start off with you, Simon, and then move to Shaheen, and then move to Pamela. In advocacy, what you're trying to do generally is persuade people to do something that they don't want to do naturally. How do you strike, and you know, you've got sort of 30, 45 seconds each on this, how do you strike that balance between keeping the dialogue going, keeping people sufficiently inside that you can continue the conversation without ticking them off, so that they say, right, we've had enough, we're not going to listen to these people anymore. And on the other hand, making sure that you don't lose the urgency of what you're trying to do because it's so important. Simon, I know you've kind of thought about that sort of issue a lot. Over to you first.
I'll go in 35 seconds, Myles. Yeah, I think yeah, several ways. I mean, obviously, if you can look for win-win scenarios, so often there are shared interests with local government or national government and the work you're trying to do. So demonstrating that what you're doing can support them. So you might have shared health agendas overall, and if you can demonstrate a new approach that works well, I think that's really important. So looking for areas where there is a shared agenda. Obviously, presenting evidence. I mean, one of the things that I found certainly working overseas is taking politicians or important people to see projects in action is a really great way of people seeing the benefits and then sort of getting it. I think that's really important. So the more you can sort of demonstrate the impact of programs and that's and how that benefits decision makers as well. And then also sort of demonstrating that that sort of communities are behind a piece of work or an approach that you're trying to navigate, and so politicians do care about the public and what they think the public think, and so sort of demonstrating that you've got a groundswell of support behind you is also very important. So that was a very quick answer to your question, Myles.
And in good time. Well done, Simon. Thank you so much. Shaheen, over to you. Yeah,
absolutely agree with Simon. I think it's understanding that there is a balance when there is a shared agenda. Often the grassroots evidence that even that Pamela presented today would be something amazing that politicians like to see. The other thing is that having integrity when it comes to showing what you need to do and placing yourselves in that situation in that sense, because often what ends up happening is you want to show something, say for example, that's happening in Yemen, but the integrity around it is, how do I as a politician or how do I as an individual know what's going on and how do we influence them? And I think part of that is kind of sharing your story with them and getting them to see the story around it. And I guess, again, it falls under the accountability framework, and you are being open in that sense and also honest. And again, we're having all that, and it depends which government you're working with or which politician you're working with, and each politician or each individual that you're working with from an advocacy approach will have a different approach. And I think part of that is striking the balance, is keep the communication open, Myles. I think that's the one thing, and keep the communication long term and make sure that the relationship has a longevity as opposed to a short-term understanding and strategy in that sense. Back over to you, Myles.
Thanks so much. That's great. You mentioned Yemen, Shaheen. It's great to see Francis Guy, who's our former ambassador in Yemen, and now running SCIAF, the Scottish equivalent of Bond, on this call. Hi, Francis. Pamela, over to you. You're muted, Pamela. Thanks.
Yes, the local community, it's quite key that we create awareness on the impact of whatever kind of activity that's happening. And it's important for them to understand the benefits of protection, for instance, protecting the environment. But also it's very key for us to provide alternatives. For instance, if you talk about fuel wood and you are trying to protect the environment, but what are the alternatives that are there? In communities, for instance, we have provided energy saving or fuel saving stoves that use less fuel. So it's always very important to provide alternatives if you're suggesting something that is not, that may not be acceptable very immediately by the communities. Thank you. Over to you, Myles.
I think you're on mute, Myles.
I'm so sorry. I had a little connection error there. I'm back and with you again. Thank you so much, all of you. And Pamela, just a little bit of historical recall. It certainly helped. You were talking about influencing politicians. It certainly helped that in Sendakau's early days, it just so happened that Sendakau was in the constituency of the then Minister for Overseas Development, Chris Patten. So he was certainly incredibly supportive of Sendakau in those early days starting up in Bath. Thank you so much to all of you for your fantastic contributions. I've been watching people's faces as this has all gone on. I know there's a huge amount of enthusiasm there for this, and it is so important if we want to make progress that we do succeed in persuading politicians in particular, but also local government, that this is so important. Now, I think the next step that Jessie has just put a poll in the chat there, and you will see that on the board. Can everybody see that there is the further events in this fantastic series? I'm not going to read it all out, but you've got it up on the screen in front of you. You have that poll. If you wouldn't mind spending a minute or two just answering that. Jessie, is there anything else that I need to say before I bring this to a conclusion? Just make sure you're keeping me on the right track.
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Myles.
Thank you so much. Well, I will leave you with it to complete the poll. But thank you so much to all of you for participating. Thank you in particular to our panelists. I thought all three of them were absolutely outstanding presentations. Really got down to the grassroots, from the grassroots to advocacy at the very, very highest level. It's sort of, I'm sorry we have one or two connection problems along the way. But congratulations again to SWIDN for putting on such a fantastic panel, but also a fantastic series of events over these 3 days. So thanks very much. Finish the poll, and we'll see you all at next year's events.